our team at geoengineeringwatch.org took a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration flying lab with top scientists in it to altitude and sampled what heavy aircraft were emitting in our skies. We processed that sample at Rinster Polytechnic University, one of the world's most renowned, found exactly what we knew we would find: climate engineering elements starting with aluminum. So again, this is all available on the geoengineeringwatch.org groundbreaking documentary, The Dimming, which we posted for free the moment it was done. And in regards to those who claim there would be whistleblowers everywhere if this was going on, not true. One, these programs are highly compartmentalized. Would we expect that the US military pilots in Vietnam that were spraying Agent Orange were told that this will kill your comrade on the ground? Of course they weren't told that. They were all compartmentalized. And two, we have an illegal federal gag order, Richard, on the nation's weathermen in the United States. National Weather Service and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration have an illegal federal gag order on them. Why would the government do that if there wasn't something extraordinary to hide?
Yes, absolutely. So, do we know who is responsible for this?
Ultimately, all roads lead to the central bankers, those who print the money. This is why the fight right now for the dollar as the global reserve currency in the United States is going down in flames, because the rest of the world has had enough of the US dollar hegemonic power. And so, but again, when they can fund whatever they want with as much resources as they want, the Pentagon officially is missing, I believe, that we know of, about $31 trillion since the late 90s. Where did they get that additional 31 trillion, let alone to have it go missing? Again, they've been able to print whatever they want for whatever they want, and the planet and its people have wrought the consequences of that. That's why the U.S. has a military machine that's bigger than the next 10 biggest militaries combined. And the result of that, what we see now, and their ability to, and this is an important part of climate engineering that people need to understand, their ability to create surface cool downs with what's called chemical ice nucleating elements. So what we have is happening right now in the U.S. It's been happening over decades, but it's happening right now. It's a stunning example of it. We have areas in parts of the northern states of the U.S. that have gone from snow to 90 plus degrees, record shattering highs, 10 degrees above the former all-time record, and they're going back to snow this week. Try to imagine that. Again, I'm talking about Fahrenheit, of course, but from snow to record-shattering midsummer high temperatures and back to snow in a week. Wow. That's geoengineering. That's from climate engineering, and they can, when they spray. Richard, have you seen mountains that have the ski slope is covered with snow, but the whole mountain is bare? You've seen that before,
yes,
probably, right?
Yes.
So this is that on a much larger scale, and when they seed the clouds with what's called chemical ice nucleating elements, and these are patented processes, it creates what's called an endothermic reaction, an energy absorbing reaction, and that creates a cold air mass that descends to the surface because the cold air is more dense, and this chemical reaction can nucleate what should have been a liquid precipitation event, i.e. a rainstorm, into a frozen precipitation event. So, and I ask people to consider their first aid kit that might sit on their shelf for 20 years at room temperature. If you mix the cold pack together, the chemicals that are in a cold pack in a first aid kit, ice instantly. And that's what this is on a much larger scale, highly toxic, but this is literally engineered winter. And the Chinese government openly announced they were doing this. Your listeners can search Chinese government engineer snowstorm. Fox News covered it, Popular Science, MSNBC, ABC. But yet, if it's brought up here, suddenly you're marginalized.
So, I mean, what you're describing is, and as we've seen, how there is this race to put everybody on a certain one power electricity to take away independent power, such as wood-burning stoves, which they're sort of planning in the UK, take away heat pumps and, not heat pumps, gas, and replace them with heat pumps. And then if you're saying that effectively you could create winter whenever they damn well like and keep people cold, and they can then turn off the electricity so you can't heat your house, that's an enormous amount of control over millions of people worldwide.
You're absolutely correct. Let me make this point abundantly clear. Although the climate science community would those that are for climate engineering would pretend this is something benevolent. That could not be further from the truth. Climate engineering in all its forms is about power and control, period. So if we go back, and I'll finish answering your question in a moment, but let's go all the way back to the beginning to every weekly geoengineeringwatch.org on-air radio update. It's called Global Alert News. We post that for free at geoengineeringwatch.org. We pay for that airtime out of pocket on 22 radio stations around the country. That's 1 hour of the most dire data that we face, the most dire threats we face. But at the beginning of that broadcast, it's key. There's a 30-second, actually it's about a 15-second clip of former U.S. President Lyndon Johnson in 1962 on film, on the record, stating that we had the power to control the world's cloud layer then, in 1962, 61 years ago.
Wow.
And that quote, "He who controls the weather controls the world." His words, not mine. So they can shut off precipitation to agricultural regions, which they are absolutely doing. We're not guessing. We can see their operations on satellite imagery. They can flash freeze crops, which they just did in California for the 6th year in a row. They allow the temperatures to force early blooms, and then they flash freeze everything with a chemical surface cool down. This is not an accident. We see it happening around the globe via either hail, drought, flash flooding, but they're hitting ag regions very, very rapidly. In regard to the flash surface cool downs, we've seen instances so extreme, Richard, that in fact in the U.S. on October 4th, 2013, in South Dakota, there was a flash snowstorm. Now, has anybody heard of a flash snowstorm before? A flash snowstorm that killed 100,000 cattle. And it started snowing at 40 degrees. Why is it snowing at 40 degrees, which would be 3 or 4 degrees C, something like that?
Right.
Why would it snow at that temperature? And at the same time, not far away in Kansas City, it was 89 degrees and raining. In Chicago, further north, it was 85 degrees and raining. How could there possibly be on October 4th a flash snowstorm that killed 100,000 cattle, and they were laying around in the mud 2 days later, dead? No snow, everything melted. We have extreme circumstances in South America. Same, 250,000 alpacas, cold-hardy alpacas, killed from the same type of flash snowstorm. And again, these are patented processes. We have those patents at geoengineeringwatch.org. We're not guessing.
Mm. This is so. If these particles are in the air, here's the thing that I always sort of come back to. Surely it's also going to be damaging those people who are paying for this. Presumably they're still breathing this in, even So it can't. I'm trying to sort of square a circle here in which the people who are orchestrating it, it must be affecting them. They can't be living in gas masks or other things.
Extraordinarily important question. Why would they do this to themselves?
Yes.
And I would point out an example I mentioned a moment ago. The detonation of 2,400 nuclear bombs all over the world contaminated virtually all life on the planet. And we have a power structure that's addicted to power. Does an addict care that the next fix might kill them? Does a cancer care that its unchecked proliferation will eventually kill the host? No. A cancer's objective is to spread and proliferate until the host eventually dies. It's a consequence. So again, we have nuclear power plants, Richard. Fukushima may be an extinction level event by itself. There's no technology to fix it, no end in sight. We have Chernobyl. That will likely be a meltdown event again because the sarcophagus is disintegrating. And yet in spite of that, we have those in power building 60 more nuke plants right now, on top of the 440 that already exist. It takes 2 to 3 decades to cold shut down a nuclear power plant. When societal collapse occurs, we're going to have Fukushima times several hundred. Next, climate engineering is also destroying the ozone layer. The ozone layer is not recovering, as we've been told, and now there's recent data as of a week ago to again corroborate what geoengineeringwatch.org has said for well over a decade, because we're metering UV radiation on the surface, which is a direct indication of ozone deterioration. We're getting UVC on the surface. That's a DNA damaging spectrum of UV radiation. It's killing plankton, killing insects, and climate engineering is absolutely the core causal factor, not hairspray cans, as we were told.
Yeah.
So the bottom line is here we have yet another existential threat directly connected to climate engineering and back to the nuclear plants, if I can weave all this together. Our now damaged atmosphere has made us very susceptible to a CME, coronal mass ejection, solar flare. If we have a major event like the Carrington event that happened in the 1800s, that would shut down grids all over the world. That would prevent nuclear power plants from being able to cool themselves. Again, Fukushima times several hundred perhaps, game over. And yet they're doing this anyway. So again, we face a cancer, a headless, heartless, soulless cancer, each part trying to protect its own interest, but with no consideration of the consequences. And a final note, if you look at psychoanalysis straight from scientific study of those in power and their mental traits, there is a common thread. And that common thread is this: a near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. We're dealing with a cancer.
You paint a very bleak picture that it seems there is no escape from if it continues. And we're, as you said already, that we're already affected by this. I mean, I've been around nearly 60 years on this planet, and I've now learnt that all those 60 years I've been subject to some form of this nasty stuff. And it probably explains a hell of a lot of ill health for a lot of people, perhaps mental health, breathing metal particulates into their, going into the bloodstream, getting into the brain, and all of those sort of things, and all of that. Is there? It says on your thing that you're fighting this. What hope have we got, and what tools have we got to stop it? And is there a positive future to look forward to? Or a glimmer?
If I could back up to one more, I'll answer that question in a moment. If I could back up to one more aspect of those in power, they do have access to medical treatments that the common public does not have access to. That involves chelation of the blood. We've interviewed one individual that has been to this facility, one in Germany, where the blood is cycled through the body into chelation technology that purges the heavy metals from the blood, and that type of treatment, perhaps once a year, would exempt them from many of the symptoms that the rest of us will deal with. Because you're correct, these bioavailable elements, the smaller the particle, the more harmful it is, the more bioavailable, the more your system absorbs it and can't get rid of it. So every person we've tested, hair, blood, urine, is packed with these metals, starting with aluminum, and it affects every part of our body's neurological system, immune system, everything. But they would have, those in power would have a means of at least mitigating some of those symptoms through that type of chelation, which is not available to the rest of us. As far as our overall picture, what we can do, this is imperative for people to face, that however dire the horizon is, if we don't face it fully, we have no chance of dealing with it. If you're standing in the middle of the freeway at rush hour, are you better off facing traffic or turning your back to it and hoping for the best?
Right.
So I think that answer is clear. So we can't know, in regard to the climate or the state of the climate, and we certainly have a very damaged planet at this point. But from any perspective, from any viewpoint on the state of the climate, how can we have any legitimate discussion about it without addressing this first? And we've seen extraordinary hypocrisy from the so-called environmental groups that will not address, will not acknowledge, will not admit to this single most damaging human activity of all. And we feel that is criminal, it's inexcusable, and they're trying to protect their 501 nonprofits so they don't address this issue. We know that because our attorneys at geoengineeringwatch.org have communicated with their attorneys. They don't want to lose their 501, so they don't want to address this issue, and that's simply not acceptable. So if we can stop this interference with the planet's life support systems, then we can assess where we're at. Until we stop this, we can't. And we can say mathematically, statistically, that these programs continue unabated. And they involve not just the spraying of these toxic particles, Richard, but also the manipulation of these particles with extraordinarily powerful frequency transmissions from ground-based facilities. This is, you've heard of HARP, perhaps in Alaska?
Yeah, vaguely, yeah, vaguely.
I encourage your listeners to search that, HAARP. That's the acronym. It's and if they search that and look at that facility, that is literally a weapon of mass destruction that is capable of transmitting millions of watts of power to the ionosphere. This is part of climate engineering operations, part of how they steer upper level wind currents. That can transmit millions of watts of power to the ionosphere, create an electrical chain reaction that heats that level of the atmosphere to extraordinarily high temperatures, and that can cause a high pressure heat dome. You've probably heard the meteorologists refer to a heat dome in recent years, and that's part of that operation. There are also ground-based facilities that manipulate these particles. So when you saturate the atmosphere with electrically conductive particles, they then become susceptible to manipulation with frequency transmission. So all of that's bombarding us, not just the absorption of these materials, but the frequency transmissions, which are far stronger than the communications transmissions that so many are fighting, justifiably so. So back to, again, if we can, this interference with the Earth's life support systems is so profound, so total, that we can't truly assess the state of the climate. We know it's damaged, but we can't assess what the planet will do, how it will respond, until or unless we stop these programs.
So the question is, how do we stop the programs?
Yes, I'm sorry, I wasn't meaning to skip that. This is how. People like you that are helping to get this out in the open so that those participating, including in the military, including defense industry personnel, including their families, so that they realize they are literally participating in their own near-term, I can't express that enough, near-term demise.
Right.
And at that point, we have a chance of stopping these programs from the inside out. It is our only chance, I would argue. If we can get this into the open, and populations around the globe understand what their governments have done to them without their knowledge or consent, that every single weather cataclysm, and how can we begin to quantify how many there are? It's now every day, all over the world. That every one of those events is now a liability for governments involved. Because would that event have happened at that place at that time without these programs? And the answer is likely no, because they've disrupted the entire system. So if we can, again, get this out in the open so people realize not just the weather cataclysm, but every breath they take is laden with these particles. And to put that into perspective, we talked about the damage earlier, but the amount of particles we're inhaling, based on recent science study, we are inhaling as many as 20 million nanoparticles with every breath we take. Try to imagine that. That sounds impossible. But consider that you can fit 100,000 nanoparticles across the width of a human hair. 100,000. And we have quantified, based on testing with one of the world's most renowned agricultural institutions, the amount of material in the precipitation over that particular state, if extrapolated around the whole globe. It looks as if they are, the data indicates that they are dispersing somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 million tons of these particles into our skies annually. That's inconceivable. It's changing soil pH values. It's killing soil microbiomes. It's killing forests. That's killing crops. Sterilizing soils. This is a fight for life. That's why I'm focused on this issue. Because it is the biggest hole in the bottom of the boat at this moment. Greatest threat we face short of nuclear cataclysm. If we don't deal with it, we're done.
During the lockdown, we had a year, I suppose, on and off with different companies, different states, different countries closing down at different periods. Presumably, and we saw the aeroplanes weren't flying as frequently. Was there a dip in the amount of these particles going into the atmosphere as a result of that? Can we actually see on a graph that there was, or were they still flying and we didn't know?
They were in many regions still there. Now, again, there was definitely a measurable alteration in some regions. It's felt the same thing after 9/11, when all the aircraft were grounded in the U.S. after 9/11.
Yeah.
That was measured statistically. We saw daytime temperatures go up, which we would expect without these particles in the atmosphere. We saw nighttime temperatures go down for the same reason. And that's key to understand the flaw of these programs, the very premise of these programs to block some of the daytime thermal energy input. You trap that heat at night, negating any stated positive effect. And we now know from the most recent science study that the entire premise for solar radiation management to mimic the cooling effect of volcanoes is completely flawed. Because even in the case of a volcanic eruption, It causes only temporary toxic cooling at the cost of a near-term worsened warming because of the damage to the atmosphere, because of the trapped heat, everything that we see, disrupted rainfall patterns. When you put all these particles in the air, you completely disrupt hydrological cycles. So again, the whole premise for this is completely flawed, completely false. This is being used as a weapon, period. And if I could give one more example to the weapon part, Richard, this is important. Right after 9/11, we had the NATO Supreme Commander, General Wesley Clark, was given a list of Middle Eastern countries that the U.S. military intended to target. Subsequently, every single one of those countries underwent a once in 1,000 year drought. Statistically, mathematically, that would be impossible to have that kind of consistency unless there was a factor in this equation that we weren't being told about. That factor is climate engineering, aka weather warfare, and that destabilized their food production, thus destabilized their populations, thus made those countries easier to manipulate, invade, occupy. And in the case of some of those countries, Iran for one, their president, their leader, went to the floor of the UN and stated such. That NATO was cutting off their precipitation, stated it on film.
Because you don't want something.
We saw none of that here. So this is simply weather warfare, and it's been going on. If we look at Project Popeye in Vietnam in the 60s, it's a matter of historical record. The U.S. was so successful at manipulating rain over the Ho Chi Minh Trail that by the 70s, the international community passed INMOD treaties, environmental modification treaties, forbidding weather manipulation for wartime. Not that anybody paid attention to that, but this is all historical record. So for those who want to pretend this is some wild conspiracy theorist, that's just people that simply don't have the courage to face the truth.
So if you were waging war, let's say two nations were waging war against one another, I can't think that anything would be happening like that at the moment. A great big continent could be possibly doing anything. But in a way, you wouldn't need to have troops on the ground and people doing that if you've got the ability just to shut off and destroy a country's food supply. Let's say a country was, I don't know, known as a breadbasket of the world and was producing most of the wheat, or in a vague scenario, just for YouTube's terms and conditions sort of thing. You wouldn't need to have troops and tanks and people being shot at and all of that, because you could easily control them that way, which then makes you think, well, if that's possible, I wonder what's the story there going on if it's just all theatre to distract us all. It seemed, as you say, because this is an incredibly powerful weapon, but who controls it? It's obviously, as you said, a global control who are all agreeing on all of this. And so it's controlled by a very small number of people at the end of the sort of the pyramid, I guess.
You are completely correct on all points. And to back into that, there's a U.S. military document, your listeners can search this online as well. It's called Owning the Weather in 2025. They are certainly there already. But in that document, what it calls weather manipulation, climate engineering, weather warfare,
I got some
as a
ideas
force
for some
multiplier.
clips.
That you can bring populations of countries to their knees without those populations ever even knowing they're under assault. You can destabilize those governments by the same means. And there's absolutely no question this is going on, because we can see their operations on satellite imagery. And let's, as far as the so-called forecasters, let's just put that into context. For example, in Northern California, we have our local forecasters, which are simply weather manipulation script readers. They know sometimes 6-7 days in advance if a particular day will be what they call now mostly sunny. And on that day, when they use that term, it's typically there's not a natural cloud anywhere in the sky, but there is jet sprayed haze, and that's exactly what it is, because we have time-lapse footage. You can see this spreading out, covering the entire horizon, blotting out the sun. So how could that so-called weather forecaster know that 7 days in advance unless they're reading a script? And we know they're reading scripts because Raytheon, private defense contractor Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin do all the weather modeling for the nation's weathermen, the agencies that are under a federal gag order that I just mentioned. And that script goes all the way down to the local meteorologist. They're literally reading scripts.
Heavens, this is so scary. I'm so pleased to have been able to talk to you about this, Dane. you're saying the solution really is ground up, from the ground, getting people to be aware of this, to talk and share it, to go to your site geoengineeringwatch.org, to do as much research as possible, but persuade people. I made a video a month or two ago called "Don't Build the Prison," and that was about people putting in the 5G, or we have cameras that are going to do the biometrics, and the people who are doing the work for the dastardly, nasty people don't necessarily know they're doing the work, or they're a small element of it. And without those workers doing what they do, the big network couldn't happen. And so I was saying, well, if you're going to build it, because people have got to have work, they've got to do the job. I was saying, well, if you've got to put in these sodding cameras and this 5G, make sure you add in a slight thing where you can nobble it when the time comes. Because these people are basically building the prison, and once they realise that's what they're doing, or in this instance, they're all contributing to poisoning the air and causing the bad weather and bringing us down to our knees.
Oh, they're doing it all.
If we're able to persuade those that what they are doing is an element of that, they are likely to stop. And if enough
No,
of them
because
stop,
they is not
it
they.
stops.
We are they. They is
Yes,
us.
and again, the key aspect, if we can get this out into the open, I would argue at that point, we have the proverbial pitchforks and torches time, when the population takes to the streets looking for anyone and everyone involved with the programs and their cover-up to hold them legally and morally accountable. In regard to our so-called elected officials, they are bought, sold, and paid for. I've had personal meetings at the Capitol of California with Governor Newsom, his top aide, and they absolutely could not dispute these programs were in existence, but they have said exactly nothing, nor will they, because that's part of their servitude to those in power. And the gravity of this issue, again, it cannot be overstated. It is not just destroying in the near term the planet's life support systems, soils, waters. It's contaminating every single breath we take, and our systems are already overburdened with toxins, and there's many sources. I'm not blaming everything on climate engineering. I want to make that clear. We've been horrible stewards of the planet. There's no question about that. We have trashed the planet.
It's not a plan.
But the intentional disruption of the planet's life support systems being the most egregious of all. And mathematically and statistically, if we don't deal with this, again, we're done. And if you look at things like the destruction of the ozone layer, for example, that by itself being an extinction level event, we have recently gotten images
for that one, I got.
for example, plankton populations from the Atlantic crashed, 90% decline. UV radiation is the single biggest factor, aside from all the pollution, the plastics, everything else. UV is killing plankton as they try to photosynthesize in the upper layers of the water column. They are being fried, literally, just like insects are as well. So we take even one aspect of that as an extinction level event. Now let's add everything else on top of that. Again, this is a fight for life, and if we don't deal with it, statistically, mathematically, we are at the end of the road. But if we can expose it, we would alter the entire paradigm, and every one of us can play a part in that. And any one of us could be the final, as I state in the end of the film, any one of us could be the final pebble that triggers the landslide of awakening. If we can do that, it will be the most quantum leap we can make in the right direction.
The Dimming is your documentary. It's available on your website. People can go and see that, as you said, for free. People can go and visit geoengineeringwatch.org to find out more. Dane, it's been an absolute privilege. Thank you for making time to talk to the viewers and myself. And I hope the viewers watching this have been able to take it in and think about it. Go and do a bit of research. Don't just take our words for it. Look it up and push the message if you go along with it. Which I think, looking at your website and what you've said, it's pretty frightening, and we probably haven't got a lot of time. Which is a story that keeps coming down us at the moment. Do you feel that we're at a tipping point at the moment now?
No, we're past the tipping point. The reality we've known is done. It's not coming back. But does that mean we don't fight to salvage what we can?
Right.
It doesn't mean that. We have an obligation. It's not just an option, it's an obligation to fight to salvage what we can. And those in power are extraordinarily desperate at this point because they can't hide the totality of what's unfolding for much longer. And at that point, and this
Well,
is
here's
critical
the
for
new
listeners to
stuff. So you
understand,
go like this to
they're
any one of
capable
your
of
guns that you want.
who knows what.
Watch what I'm gonna
And
do.
I
so
want
you
to
can do it right now.
clarify that in
Take
this
this,
mix that we
dump
know
this
is in our
thing on it,
precipitation, that
just like
includes
that.
not just heavy metals,
Put
but
that in there
polymer
like that.
fibers and
And then you
graphene.
bring
Those
this one
two
back
elements
around to the same thing.
specifically can be used
Same one.
militarily in biological warfare
Snap
as
it on.
biological carrier platforms. What's that mean? It
This
means
way.
they can be used to carry a
This way you got an
pathogen
arm
from the
strap.
clouds to the ground. We know that the second most
Right.
recognized climate engineer, Dr. Kim
Right, so you
Caldera,
can have
was a
them.
U.S. Department of
So that
Defense
takes care of
scientist.
one, but then
We
you need
own
another
an
one for
audio
each
of
side.
Changing Watch.org of
For
him
a side
stating
holder.
what he did for
And
the
for
U.S.
that one,
Department of Defense
I
was
would
to
do-
design ways of spraying pathogens into
You're gonna
clouds
do
to
a belt out
affect
of
the
it. Do you have an
population
old
below.
belt that you have
He
in
works
your
for Bill Gates now, interestingly enough. So again, why did we think that at some point, if they become too desperate, they would use these platforms to disperse something like Marburg or Ebola, and which would completely level the playing field in short order. So I can't express enough the
Gravity of it.
need, the gravity of this to expose what's happening in our skies and bring it to a halt. And so this fight involves all of us. Again, every one of us could be any one of us could be the final factor here that reaches a critical mass of awareness. And we at ChangingWatch.org, our links can be shared online. We encourage that. Facebook's trying very hard to censor us. We actually have a lawsuit involved with that.
Yeah,
So
if I can find more of these.
it's sharing
then you
from a
can
personal
use those
email, sharing the
straps.
links. We need all the help we can get. If we can reach a critical mass, we will change this equation.
Brilliant stuff. Well, let's end on that hopeful note to keep people up and positive. I'm sure people will certainly take note of that and do as much sharing as possible. Thank you, Dane, so much. I really appreciate you coming on the show and
So
you know,
this
telling us
one is fit,
the
it
gravity
does.
of this
So
situation.
one,
Everywhere we turn at the moment, there
you
seems to
grab
be
two, just
things,
kinda do
but
the
we've
same
got to be
thing.
brave and we've got to be strong and we've got to do it.
In and out,
There's
or
just no
it's
other
solid?
choice.
The honor is mine, Richard. Thank you very much for your willingness to address this most dire issue. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. Do check out geoengineeringwatch.org. A big thanks to Dane for talking to us today. I will be back with more interviews coming up. But please go and investigate this, because as you breathe, you're breathing in this rubbish and we don't want it. Take care, Dane. Thanks very much, viewers. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
So yeah, so you could probably find them to fit everywhere. And you'd have to, do something like this.
It's a BOGO blast at Michael's. Fill your car with deals on canvas, frames, and more. Now through April 29th.
Hello and welcome back to the channel, and thank you for joining me on another of my interviews. Today I'm talking to a very interesting man, Sovereign Pete. That might give you a clue onto what we're going to be talking about. This is the Sovereign Project, a project that is designed to link people who are sovereign together and to help those who want to be free. Pete, welcome to the show. It's lovely to have you with me this afternoon.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
We, as you may know on the channel, may not know, we've been talking about natural law, common law, sovereignty, all of this, and had many different guests who have a different look at sovereignty. You're called the Sovereign Project, so if anyone knows anything about sovereignty and stuff, it should be you. I think we've never been in a time where being sovereign is more important. And a lot of people are obviously interested in that and how you become sovereign, what you need to do, is it complicated, is it easy, and all of that. So hopefully we can explore some more about that. So maybe we could just start with a little bit about yourself and how you sort of thought about sovereignty and becoming sovereign, and then what the project's about.
Sure, yeah. It all began years ago. We're talking almost 30 years ago when we had access to the internet for the first time. It was in the 1990s, early 92, so I got my first computer. And I knew that I was being lied to. Whenever I used to see something on TV, I think, hang on a minute, I'm being lied to. This is not correct. So I'd go off and do some research. And over time, I began researching everything that the government does or did or said and
So you don't
found the
want it in
truth.
front of your finger,
This
like that.
has covered many different topics. The first one I
Put these two
delved
together so
into
you
was
have more
climate change,
length.
which is completely bogus, complete scam. So I got into that, and I started researching other things like 9/11 happened, started researching that. That led me onto the financial system. Then I realised that there was a great reset coming. I realised they were going to reset the financial system around 2025. This is in about 2010 is when I figured this out. I better start warning people. So I was starting to warn people back then. And as I was doing my own personal journey, I was realising that we've been conned or scammed by people within government. And what I found out is I discovered how government actually operates. And one of the things that people don't understand is government is in fact a legal fiction corporation. The UK is a corporation, okay? So this led me down the rabbit hole of trying to learn, and I also had to learn to read. So the average person out there is illiterate. You might be able to recognise text on a piece of paper, but you can't read because you don't understand the meaning behind the words. This is where so many people are failing and getting caught up in the system. Now, when I decided to actually set up the Sovereign Project was just after 2020. Obviously a certain incident happened and everyone was panicking over a certain medical procedure and they were being mandated to have this. And I was looking at everybody, what's the problem? Don't you understand how mandates work? You can't be mandated without a contract. Contract comes first, you agree and consent to the mandate, then the mandate comes second. And this is when I realised that the average person has no clue how contract law works, at all.
Yeah.
Like the average person doesn't even know the difference between lawful and legal. And perhaps we can get into that.
Yes, no, absolutely. And we've been sort of talking about this, and I think you're right. You know, people forget that they have consent to things, and some people are not aware, as you say, not aware of contracts, and think that contracts is something that you just do with, say, a utility company, and you've got to sign to their agreement, and it's very one-sided. And of course it shouldn't be.
In fact, utility companies are not even a contract, it's a service agreement.
Right.
And you are the one who controls it. This is what people don't understand. You control the service agreement, not them. You're the customer. The customer is always right. So, yes, so the contract stuff. People don't understand what a contract is. So let's just touch on what law versus legal is. Because people have got to get the basics right before you understand how the whole system operates. And hopefully we'll have time, we'll get into that. Now, law is something beyond your reach, okay? You cannot change it. It's beyond man's grasp, okay? For example, the law of gravity. If I drop this pen, it goes down, okay?
Yeah.
So, there we go, everybody. I'll just get on. It goes down.
Yeah.
I can't change that law. I can't make
it's
the
called
pen go up. So
electromagnetic.
that's law. Law is something you can't change, okay? It's beyond your grasp. Legal always means contract. So whenever you hear that word, someone says you've done something illegal, what they're actually doing is they are referring to a policy within a contract. So when the policeman pulls you over, by the way, policeman means policy enforcer, and that would be a corporate policy enforcer. Policemen do not deal in law. So a policeman pulls you over and says, you've done an illegal U-turn. And you go, oh, okay then, and you show me the contract then, when I've agreed to it.
And of course they can't.
They can't,
They
because
can't.
they've tricked, there is a contract, but they've tricked you into it.
Right.
And they can't tell you the truth, because then their deception will be shown to you. So they do it because, or the way they do it is because you registered your car with DVLA. And once you've registered your car with DVLA, you've accepted the highway code, and that is the contract that you've accepted, and now the policeman's pulling you over because you've breached a policy within the DVLA corporation contract. Does that make sense?
Yes. And just, I don't want to stop your flow by interrupting very often, but if you don't know that you've entered into a contract, from my understanding, which is very, very small, and I'm learning this all the time from people like yourself, if you don't know, it's not fully disclosed to you. So in theory, it should be null and void. But
Correct.
Effectively, they don't treat you like that because you've registered the title of that. vehicle and you've entered into the contract, and so that's what they assume. And I guess this is down to the presumption. We'll get into all of that.
Absolutely correct. You have to have informed consent. That's the key word here. Okay, you can't just be tricked into a contract. Say, for example, a car salesman was going to sell you a car that had 250,000 miles on it, but he wound it back to only 50. He didn't tell you, but you've entered into a contract to buy the car. Well, that's not informed consent. You were not informed that the car was clocked. So, informed consent is key, okay? In fact, there's 4 basic areas that I try and help people with. First of all, the burden of proof is placed on the one making the claim. So it doesn't matter who it is, it could be a policeman, a bailiff, or whatever, it could be someone sending you something through the post, it does not matter. If they are making a claim, the burden of proof is on them. So don't panic, don't think you've got to prove anything. You go, no, you've made a claim, burden of proof is on you. You've got to prove your claim. And then there's areas that you should be challenging. One is obligation. This is where most people don't even understand obligation at all. It's like the mandate stuff. I'm saying, are you even obligated to do it? No, you're not. If people understood obligation, so you challenge the obligation. Am I obligated to pay the thing or do the thing? For example, council tax. Am I obligated to pay it? Turns out I'm not. I'm not obligated to pay it. There is no contract between me and the council. The council is a legal fiction corporation. It's a privately owned, for-profit corporation. No different than McDonald's. Do I have a contract with the Leicester City Council, the Derby City, whatever council? No, I don't. Am I obligated to pay them? No, I'm not. Then there's authority.
So I'm just going to interrupt you on that one because two things, and I'm hoping I can hold both of those thoughts in my head at the same time. I will try. Firstly, there is a barrister. I won't mention his full name, but people will know. You know who. But he's very into sort of martial arts. So shall we just say that? That might identify him. Who has made over the last 12 months a number of claims that this sort of information is bogus and rubbish, and that. And I noticed somebody sent me a link actually to his to a comment that he made that said, no, the law is made by the government, and the way you know that is if you go to the government's website, it tells you, and you just think, oh, so no, yeah. So it's like I make the law, and here's a page I've written that says I've made the law, which is absolute nonsense. The other thing, which now has a solution. I knew that was going to happen.
It always happens.
It always happens about the. Oh yes. So yes, I've remembered the other thing is an argument that seems logic to me is if you're born and you have nothing, one thing that everyone must surely agree to is that you have the right to shelter. That you haven't got the right. Sorry, you shouldn't not have the right to shelter. In other words, you're just allowed to perish. If therefore you've got the right to shelter, you should be able to have some sort of house with a roof on it. If that's the case,
yes.
Why do you have to pay a tax just to shelter? Because it's impossible to buy a house without having to have a tax, which is the council tax.
Right. Okay. There's a lot to unpack there.
Oh right, sorry about that.
So
I don't want to throw you from your basic tenets so far because you're going really well. You're making it so clear. This is what I really I'm enjoying about this. Whereas people have tried to put these points across and perhaps they've been a bit sort of sloppy and what have you. But you're doing so. You obviously live and breathe this.
Thank you. Well, this is what I tend to do. Is I tend to crunch through a lot of legalese, paperwork, nonsense. I've been doing it for decades, and I distill it down into a language that people understand, and I talk in layman's terms. But let's go back to rights. Now, the thing with rights are not there to give you resources, okay? So you can't say you ever have a right to something, because then that has to be provided to you. So if I said, for example, I have a right to this cup of coffee, and that means someone has to provide me with this cup of coffee. Well, that makes them a slave. If they have to do what I will, because I say it's my right to have this cup of coffee, then they have to be a slave to me. But going back to your shelter thing.
Yes.
Now, we've got to try and understand what rights are. A lot of people get this wrong, okay? Rights operate within your jurisdiction and within your dominion. Okay, and rights are a package deal. This is another thing that people don't understand. You just don't get rights on their own. And you only get rights when you've reached the age of consent. All right. This is another thing that people got to understand. Children don't have rights. All right, because a right comes in a package deal, and I'll explain this. So a right comes with your authority, your court, your law, your jurisdiction, and it's your freedom. Now, children operate in the jurisdiction of the parents. Okay. By the way, everyone listening in, I'm using the word child and parent as the Oxford English Dictionary, not Black's Law. Hopefully everyone understands that parent and child are legal terms, okay? Parent is the pair who pay rent, and child is chattel.
That's the parent who pays rent.
Yeah, the pair who pay rent, because what you've become, when you're a parent, what you've become is you've given up your child to the state owns them,
Yes.
you become a parent, and then you must pay the state to have your children. Children means chattel. So if you're dealing with social services and you knock on your door and say, are you the parents, are they your children? And you say yes, they're going to take your kids.
Right.
Because you've admitted you're the parent.
Parent. But if you say I'm the mother and father.
Correct. If I'm the mother or father, and that's my boy or girl, social services can't move on you. Well, they'll still try if you've registered the child, because obviously if you've registered the child, then technically the state owns the child, okay? Now, in reality, they don't. Now, what I try and do is a lot of people are panicking over the system. They're panicking, oh my God, you know, the living in fear. No. The system is so fragile, it's unbelievable. When you learn how it works, you'll be laughing, because you'll be able to work past the system. You can operate above the system. This is what we do at the Sovereign Fraternity. We operate above the system. Well, we're learning to. Now, going back to the...
To the rights.
To the rights, yes. And we can, if we get time, we'll get back to the child and the registration of the birth certificate. Rights. Okay, so when you have a right, you have to have your authority to enforce it. Okay? And you have to use your court to do so. Now, this is something that's been stolen from us. See, everyone thinks you go to court. You can't go to court. If you go to court, you're going to someone else's court, aren't you?
Yeah.
That means you're in someone else's jurisdiction. You've given up your authority. They have control over you. You can't go to court. My court is here with me all the time.